Hello, everybody, and welcome to the fourth in our series of interviews ahead of the Shelley 200 conference in the summer of 2022. With us this time is one of our advisory board members, Professor Sharon Ruston. Sharon is the head of the English department at the University of Lancaster, and her ongoing research on literature, science and medicine in the Romantic period have produced several wonderful books, including Shelley and Vitality, Romanticism and Introduction, and Creating Romanticism, Case Studies in the Literature, Science and Medicine of the 1790s. She also co-edited the collected letters of Sir Humphry Davy, and she is the principal investigator in the ongoing project to transcribe Davy's notebooks, many of which have never been transcribed before. And her most recent book, The Science of Life and Death in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, has very recently been published, and the link to purchase it will be in the description box of this video. So hi Sharon, thank you for doing this interview with me. To start off, could you please tell me what was your first experience of reading Shelley?
So I can't really remember. Isn't that terrible? So I did this period for A-level history, and I remember writing an essay on the Corn Laws repeal. And then I knew that I knew the Shelley quote on the Jam album, and that Paul Weller thought that Shelley was cool. So there was that. I knew that. But then when I came to university, I was taught by Kelvin Everest in my first year. And I imagine that was the first time that I encountered Shelley. But I can't really remember, which is really terrible. But it clearly had a huge impact on me, because I then went and did my PhD on Shelley and first book and all the rest of it. But I don't remember that eureka moment, unfortunately.
No, that's yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it clearly did have a huge impact because you've gone on to write so much about Shelley. I think the next question we'd like to know the answer to, how has your past work on Shelley, like Shelley and Vitality, informed your interest in Davy?
So the first time I came across Davy was because of Shelley, and so I just remember reading Carleen Adamson, I think, was talking about in one of the Bodley and Shelley manuscripts. She had those notes that Shelley had written on Davy's agricultural chemistry book, and there's like 18 pages of really detailed notes about potatoes and things like this. And surprisingly, perhaps, I was like, who is this person? What is this? And started looking into it a bit, and then started getting quite fascinated by Humph on his own. And that was my first time that I looked at the notebooks, because I went to the Royal Institution and sat in the archives and was looking at these notebooks. And the one that I used for my PhD thesis and first book was a very early notebook where Davy is a proper radical, and he's chatting with Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Robert Southey and all fired up about things. And he writes a load about materialism and how the mind is a machine and things like this, like this really radical stuff that you could get into loads of trouble for at that time. And then what happens is, as Davy gets older, he gets much less interesting and more conservative, and then he went back over the notebooks and tried to cross all this stuff out. So I was just absolutely hooked then, because I was like, oh my God, like I can see that you've tried to revise your history. And also, who were you doing that for? Like, did you think that I'd be sitting here and looking into this stuff? So I guess that was the first time that I kind of thought about Davy. And I found loads more stuff. Like, Davy is kind of such a prominent figure that lots of people Shelley admired in science and medicine cite Davy. So John Abernethy talks about Davy having done things which Davy didn't even do, but like he becomes this kind of almost mythological person who is the best in science at that time. So I think, yeah, that's why I kind of came across Davy through Shelley, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, that's so interesting. What a cool way to have kind of fallen into studies on Davy. So yeah, I think building on what you've just been saying, I was wondering if you could tell us about some of the similarities that you've discovered between Davy and Shelley as your research progressed.
So I don't think there were many similarities, because I mean there may have been more at the beginning when Davy was this kind of firebrand, hot-headed, quite radical, very handsome young man. But then Davy he just becomes so different. I mean, like Wordsworth and Coleridge, he kind of changes quite drastically. And Shelley doesn't, does he? He kind of stays the same. And I think Shelley would have been just a step too far for Davy. I don't think he would have been invited round. I mean, Davy was friends with Byron, and his wife was friends with Byron, and Byron does go around to their house, and they have like these literary soirees and things. But I think Shelley would have been just too scandalous, really, for them to kind of get on with. And actually, I found a letter that Jane Davy writes when she's in Geneva at the same time, and she's saying, oh, there's this group of, and I'm sure it's about the Shelleys, and she kind of writes it as if everyone knows who she's talking about. And they're just far too scandalous for her to socialize with, and she's kind of gossiping about them in the letter, and all the things that they're getting up to. She talks about Hellenism, which I think is probably kind of code word for all kinds of things that white people can't talk about. So it's a great letter as well. I was quite pleased with that one. So yeah, I don't think they would have got on really at all. I mean, I wonder, Shelley didn't go on with an awful lot of people, did he? So yes, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because Davy's then so important in Mary Shelley's work as well, because she pretty much word for word uses one of Davy's lectures in Professor Waldman's speeches, and Frankenstein's got a lot to do with Davy. So it's almost, I mean, maybe there's a connection there. But actually, when I think about Percy Shelley's interest in science, he was always much more benevolent about science and kind of wanted it to do good. And so Thomas Jefferson Hogg is always saying, oh, Shelley's being ridiculous and thinks we can solve world hunger and do all these great things if we learn about science. And actually, that's just so lovely, and reflects badly upon Hogg, I think, rather than Percy Shelley. Whereas Davy is much more kind of scary in lots of ways. He's not really he wouldn't be on the side of the good people now. I don't think he'd be a fracker. I think he'd be an interventionist. He's someone who, all that stuff that she says in Frankenstein about, the horrible stuff about following nature to her hidden recesses and the nastiness. That's Davy. So I think they're very different, really, Shelley and Davy.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. The next question, does Shelley feature in the science of life and death in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and talking about, kind of the ways that he was also influenced in contemporary science? You've just touched on it, but if you could expand on that a little bit, that would be great.
So he does feature, and a lot, and it was one of the things I was slightly worried about. Is it too much, because this is a book about Mary Shelley? But yeah, I mean, I guess I know so much about Shelley's interest in science, and so it's a strange thing, isn't it, to say, well, we know that Percy Shelley read this book, and so perhaps he talked to Mary about it. But quite often there's evidence in Frankenstein that she knew this stuff too. And they read things together. Anna Mercer's kind of done loads of good work on that, hasn't she? And so I know that they were reading Davy's chemistry together, for example, when she was writing Frankenstein, and that's how that all gets in there. There's also, like, I kind of do a whole thing about Shelley being obsessed with death, and the stuff about the ghoulish stuff, and then I also have sections on, like, the poem Mutability, and how that kind of shows that he was really interested in the principle of life, and then those conversations that he has with Polidori and Byron about that clearly influenced Frankenstein. So he's a very big presence. He's also looms large in obviously the biographical stuff, but I kind of wanted to there. I kind of do quite a detailed bit about Shelley, about Mary's miscarriage, the first one that she has, and the kind of language that's used. And Percy doesn't come out particularly well from any of that. And like at one point she confides to Hogg because she says Percy's afraid he's got milk fever, which is this thing. And, you know, he just comes across as kind of not the most feeling, or I don't know. Anyway, I mean, I kind of look into that a bit, and then I do quite a bit as well with Percy's own medical problems and the doctors that he had and the treatment that he was given and things he was advised to do, like stop writing poetry because that was bad for you. It would excite you too much. And so, you know, he's very useful, I guess, because he kind of is a way into what I hope is both of theirs knowledge of science and medicine. But I also look at Mary Wollstonecraft's knowledge of science and medicine, and William Godwin's as well. I think it is partly because there's less known about Mary Shelley's own reading and things like that. So you have to sometimes come at it slightly at an angle. But if you find the evidence for it in Frankenstein, then it's there, isn't it? And you're just kind of speculating on how it got there, I suppose.
Yeah, that's so good as well, because she does deserve to be considered kind of, you know, separately, obviously within the context of reading with Shelley and Godwin as well. But yeah, that's great. Thank you. Last question. What is your favorite Shelley poem and why?
So I think it's Mutability, which is maybe quite an unusual one, but it's the poem that I've come back to most often. I think it's really interesting, and I think he gets it spot on. And so obviously I've always been interested in what he thought of life, and said that at this time there were these two surgeons that were having this discussion about the principle of life, John Abernethy and William Lawrence, and that Shelley knew about this, and he kind of engages with that debate. And this poem really is thinking about that. And it's kind of this idea that humans and human life is all about change and restlessness. So we're like clouds that are constantly shifting and changing and moving. And one thing I've been trying to think about for a long time is that chemists like Davy and other scientists as well thought that all of the elements in the world already existed. So you can't create, John Dalton says, you can't create a particle of hydrogen as much as you can't destroy a planet. Little did they know that we destroy things. But anyway, so there's this idea that everything in the world is already existing. And so all that happens is that we're just constantly shifting and changing through ever varying forms. And I think that really appeals to Shelley, because it means things aren't fixed, and it's quite an optimistic way of being. You could imagine that things can change all the time, and institutions and organizations aren't fixed in their evilness, but they could, you know, it could be a better day tomorrow, and spring will come and the seasons will change. And so I think he finds a lot of, you know, I can't imagine what it was like to be him in that time and to be so different politically. Well, I mean, maybe I'm quite different politically from many of the people in Britain these days, but to feel so different and so unusual, and maybe it was helpful to think that there would be change, that the change would come, even if it wasn't in his day. So I like the idea that there's a kind of scientific basis for that political principle that I think he had, and that appealed to him.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of peace in that line, isn't there? Is it naught else exists but mutability? Yeah, so peaceful.
Yeah, good. I'm glad you think that, because you could think it was entirely unpeaceful, where things would never stay the same and they were constantly changing. But yeah, it's always, I've taught it quite a few times, and students love it as well, and they quite like it. And I like the idea as well that emotions are changing all the time. So one time you think this thing, and then the next day you might think an entirely different thing about it, and it kind of recognizes that. So yeah, I think that's my favorite.
Thank you. What a good answer. Okay, well, thank you so much for talking with me today. It's been so great to hear your thoughts ahead of the conference next year. And thank you everybody else for watching too. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. The links to all of our social medias, to the conference website, and to purchase Sharon's book, The Science of Life and Death in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, can be accessed in the description box below this video. And there'll also be the link to help transcribe the Davy notebooks, which is still an ongoing project. So it'd be great if you could visit that page. Thank you, everybody.